They mocked humanity's knowledge of war, until they heard the Vietnam veteran story. Silence fell over the assembly hall as the scarred human rose from his seat. The Zaron commanders, resplendent in their gleaming exo-armor, watched with a mix of curiosity and disdain as the aged veteran made his way to the speaker's podium. Whispers rippled through the ranks of the alien delegation. What could this relic of a bygone era possibly have to say that would be of any relevance to the looming conflict between their two civilizations? The man at the podium, Captain Frank Monroe, cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. His weathered features, etched with the lines of a lifetime of hardship and battle, held the room in a vice-like grip. You stand before us, mocking our primitive ways, our simplistic understanding of warfare, Monroe began, his voice steady and clear. You speak of conquest, of the grand battles you've waged across the stars. But let me tell you a story, a tale of a war fought not with lasers and starships, but with grit, determination, and the unbreakable will of the human spirit. General Thrakis, the leader of the Zaron delegation, leaned forward in his seat, his reptilian eyes narrowing. Spare us your nostalgic ramblings, human, he growled. What could your ancient conflicts possibly teach us that we have not already mastered? Monroe met the alien's gaze unflinchingly. Vietnam, he said simply. A war that taught us the true cost of underestimating one's enemy. A war where superior technology and firepower meant nothing in the face of an adversary who understood the land, who could disappear into the jungle and strike without warning. The Zaron commanders exchanged skeptical glances, but remained silent as Monroe continued. We went into that war arrogant and unprepared, much like you are now, the veteran said. We thought our advanced weapons and training would make short work of a bunch of peasant farmers. But the Viet Cong, they understood the terrain, the weather, the very soul of the jungle. They made it their ally, and it became our worst nightmare. Monroe's eyes grew distant, as if seeing once again the emerald hell of the Vietnamese rainforest. We learned the hard way that war isn't just about who has the biggest guns. It's about adaptability, about using the environment to your advantage. The Viet Cong, they were masters at it. They dug tunnels, miles and miles of them, right under our feet. They could appear out of nowhere, strike, and then vanish like ghosts. We never knew where the next attack would come from. Thrakis shifted in his seat, a flicker of unease crossing his features. The notion of an enemy who could move unseen, who could use the very ground beneath one's feet against them, it was not something the Zaron had ever encountered in their campaigns of conquest. And then there were the traps, Monroe went on, his voice hardening. Simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. A soldier could be walking through the brush 1 minute, then bleeding out the next, all because of a sharpened stake or a tripwire hidden in the undergrowth. The Viet Cong, they made an art out of turning the jungle itself into a weapon. The human delegation sat in rapt silence, hanging on Monroe's every word. For many of them, the Vietnam War was a distant chapter in their species' bloody history, but the way the old soldier spoke of it made it feel as real and immediate as if it were happening just outside the assembly hall. We had to adapt, Monroe said, had to learn to think like our enemy, to anticipate their moves and counter their tactics. It was a hard lesson, paid for in blood and sweat and tears, but it taught us that true strength lies in resilience, in the ability to face the unknown and come out the other side. He turned back to the Zaron delegation, his eyes blazing with conviction. So mock us if you will, discount the experiences that have shaped us as a species. But know this, humanity will not cower before you. We have faced nightmares you can scarcely imagine, and we have endured. Underestimate us at your own peril. With that, Monroe stepped down from the podium, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The Zaron commanders looked at one another, their earlier contempt replaced by a flicker of doubt. The humans in the hall stood a little straighter, a little prouder, as if Monroe's words had rekindled a fire within them. And so the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the galaxy had ever seen, a clash of civilizations, of philosophies, of the very nature of war itself. The Zaron Empire, with all its technological might and martial prowess, would soon learn the true measure of humanity's resolve, forged in the crucible of conflicts like Vietnam. The lessons of that distant war, it seemed, were about to take on a cosmic significance. In the days that followed Monroe's speech, an uneasy tension settled over the human Zaron summit. The alien delegation, once so dismissive of Earth's military capabilities, now regarded their hosts with a newfound wariness. Monroe's tales of guerrilla warfare and jungle-born nightmare had struck a chord, forcing the Zaron strategists to re-evaluate their long-held notions of what constituted a formidable adversary. For their part, the human representatives walked with a renewed sense of purpose, their steps a little more confident, their gazes a little more defiant. Monroe's words had reminded them of the indomitable spirit that had carried their species through countless trials and tribulations, from the trenches of World War I to the sands of Iraq. As the two sides continued their negotiations, seeking to avert the looming specter of interstellar war, Monroe found himself called upon again and again to share his experiences, to offer insight into the unconventional tactics and psychological resilience that had defined the Vietnam conflict. In one particularly heated exchange, a Zaron commander named Zareth challenged the old veteran, his tone dripping with condescension. "You speak of traps and ambushes as if they were some grand strategic innovation," the alien sneered. "But such primitive tactics would be useless against the might of our armada. Our sensors would detect any hidden threats, our weapons would vaporize your pathetic defenses." Monroe met Zareth's gaze evenly, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're probably right," he conceded. "Against your technology, our physical traps would be little more than a nuisance. But tell me, Commander, how do your ships and sensors fare against the traps of the mind? Against the fear and doubt that can turn even the most advanced army into a bunch of jumpy, trigger-happy paranoids?" Zareth's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent as Monroe pressed on. In Vietnam, the real battle wasn't just in the jungles and rice paddies. It was in the minds of the soldiers, in the constant, gnawing fear of an enemy that could be anywhere, that could strike at any time. The Viet Cong, they understood that. They used that fear as a weapon, just as surely as they used their AK-47s and punji sticks. The Zaron commander shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. Psychological warfare was not a concept the Zaron military had ever had to grapple with. Their enemies had always been tangible, quantifiable, something that could be targeted and eliminated with the cold efficiency of their advanced weaponry. Imagine, Monroe continued, being light years from home, surrounded by an environment that's completely alien to you. Every shadow could be hiding an enemy, every strange noise could be a prelude to an attack. Your sensors might be able to detect physical threats, but they can't do a damn thing about the threats your own mind conjures up. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Zareth's. "That's the kind of war we fought in Vietnam. A war of nerves, of mental endurance. And it's the kind of war you'll be fighting if you underestimate the human capacity for unconventional warfare." Zareth, to his credit, did not flinch away from Monroe's intense gaze. But there was a new respect in the alien's eyes, a grudging acknowledgement of the old soldier's hard-earned wisdom. As the days turned into weeks and the negotiations dragged on, Monroe's influence on the proceedings grew more and more pronounced. The human delegation increasingly turned to him for guidance, seeing in the grizzled veteran a symbol of their species' indomitable spirit. Even some of the Zaron commanders began to seek out his counsel, eager to glean whatever insights they could into this strange new form of warfare they now faced. And through it all, Monroe remained a steady presence, a living embodiment of the lessons Vietnam had taught him so many decades ago. He spoke of resilience in the face of adversity, of the power of determination and sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness. He talked of the bonds forged between soldiers who had endured the unendurable together, and of the scars, both physical and mental, that never truly healed. Yet even as the old veteran's words brought the two sides closer to a mutual understanding, the specter of war still loomed on the horizon. For all the progress that had been made, the fundamental differences between the human and Zaron ways of life remained a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The humans, with their fierce independence and stubborn refusal to submit to any form of tyranny, would never accept the Zaren's vision of a galaxy united under their iron-fisted rule. And the Zaren, with their unwavering belief in their own superiority and their divine right to conquer, would never willingly relinquish their dreams of empire. As tensions mounted and tempers flared, it seemed increasingly likely that only the fires of war could forge a lasting peace between the two civilizations. And as Monroe watched the gathering storm clouds with a weary sense of inevitability, he knew that the lessons he had learned in the jungles of Vietnam were about to be put to the ultimate test. For in the end, it would not be the strength of arms or the prowess of technology that decided the fate of the galaxy. It would be the strength of the human spirit, the unbreakable will to endure and overcome, that would determine whether humanity would stand tall among the stars or be forever consigned to the footnotes of galactic history. And so, as the first shots of the human-Zaren war erupted across the stars, Frank Monroe prepared himself for one final battle, one last chance to impart the hard-won wisdom of Vietnam to a new generation of soldiers. For he knew, better than anyone, that in war, it was not the weapons that made the difference, but the warriors who wielded them. As the human-Zaren war raged across the stars, Frank Monroe found himself thrust into the heart of the conflict, a reluctant but invaluable advisor to the human forces battling the alien invaders. From the bridge of flagship battlecruisers to the muddy trenches of distant colony worlds, the old veteran carried the lessons of Vietnam with him, a living repository of hard-earned wisdom in a galaxy gone mad. To the soldiers under his command, Monroe was a legend, a figure of almost mythic proportions. They whispered stories of his exploits in the jungles of Earth, of the uncanny ability to anticipate the enemy's moves and the unshakable courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In a war where hope was a precious commodity, Monroe's presence was a talismanic reassurance, a symbol of humanity's unbreakable spirit. But for all the awe and reverence he inspired, Monroe himself remained haunted by the ghosts of his past. In the chaos and carnage of the war, he often found himself transported back to the steaming hell of Vietnam, the memories of fallen comrades and unspeakable horrors blurring with the reality of the present conflict. One particularly harrowing battle found Monroe and a squad of human soldiers pinned down on a jungle world, the dense foliage and oppressive heat an eerie echo of the Vietnam of his youth. As Zaren drones buzzed overhead and plasma bolts sizzled through the undergrowth, the old veteran felt a familiar sense of dread settle over him. Beside him, a young private named Jake Harrington trembled with fear, his eyes wide and haunted in a face streaked with sweat and grime. Monroe recognized the look all too well. It was the same expression he had seen on countless fresh-faced recruits in Vietnam, the dawning realization of their own mortality in a world gone mad. "I can't do this," Harrington whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "I'm not ready. I'm not strong enough." Monroe placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You're stronger than you know," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You're here, aren't you? You're still fighting, still breathing. That takes a kind of strength that can't be measured in muscle or firepower." Harrington looked up at the old veteran, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep going, even when everything seems hopeless?" Monroe smiled sadly, the weight of a lifetime of war etched into the lines of his face. "You find something to hold on to," he said. "A reason to keep pushing forward, even when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to give up. For me, it was the men I fought beside, the knowledge that I couldn't let them down. For you, it might be something different. But whatever it is, you cling to it like a lifeline, and you never let go." As Monroe spoke, the battle around them seemed to fade into the background, the cacophony of war momentarily drowned out by the strength of his words. Harrington nodded slowly, a newfound resolve hardening in his eyes. "I understand," he said, his voice still shaky but tinged with a new determination. "I won't let you down, sir. I won't let any of us down." Monroe clapped the young man on the back, a gesture of camaraderie and respect. "I know you won't, son," he said. Now let's show these Zaron bastards what human soldiers are made of. With a roar of defiance, the two men leapt back into the fray, their weapons blazing as they charged into the heart of the enemy lines. All around them, the human forces rallied, inspired by the example of the grizzled old veteran and the young private who fought at his side. It was a scene that would play out again and again across the battlefields of the human Zaron War, the indomitable human spirit, forged in the crucible of conflicts like Vietnam, rising to meet the challenges of a new and terrifying era. And always at the forefront, leading by example and sheer force of will, was Frank Monroe, the living embodiment of a species that refused to be broken. As the war ground on, Monroe's influence on the human forces only grew. His unconventional tactics and psychological insights became the stuff of legend, studied and emulated by officers and enlisted personnel alike. Under his guidance, the humans began to turn the tide of the war, using the Zaron's own overconfidence and rigid thinking against them. In battle after battle, the human forces lured their technologically superior foes into carefully laid traps, using the terrain and the environment to neutralize the Zaron's advantages. They struck from the shadows, fading into the jungles and mountains like the ghosts of the Viet Cong, only to reappear with devastating effect. And always, they clung to the lessons of resilience and adaptability that Monroe had drilled into them, refusing to succumb to despair or surrender, no matter how dire the circumstances. Yet even as the tide of the war began to turn in humanity's favor, Monroe knew that the true test was yet to come. For the Zaron, facing the prospect of defeat for the first time in their long history of conquest, were growing increasingly desperate and unpredictable. And in their desperation, they were willing to unleash horrors that even the most battle-hardened human soldiers could scarcely imagine. As reports of Zaron atrocities began to filter back from the front lines, entire colonies massacred, prisoners subjected to unspeakable tortures, weapons of mass destruction unleashed on civilian populations, Monroe realized that the war had entered a new and terrifying phase. No longer was it a simple clash of arms and ideologies, now, it was a struggle for the very soul of the galaxy, a battle to determine whether the future would be shaped by the Zaron's ruthless tyranny or the human values of freedom and self-determination. And as he looked out over the shattered landscape of a war-torn world, watching as human and Zaron forces clashed in a brutal dance of destruction, Frank Monroe knew that the ultimate test of his Vietnam-forged wisdom was yet to come. For in the end, it would be the strength of the human spirit, the unbreakable will to endure and overcome, that would decide the fate of the galaxy. And he would be there to guide and inspire that spirit, to the very end. As the war dragged on, the toll on both sides grew ever more terrible. Entire worlds were reduced to ashes, their populations scattered to the winds or pressed into service as unwilling soldiers in the Zaron war machine. The once mighty human fleet, battered by years of relentless combat, was reduced to a shadow of its former self, its ships held together more by the sheer willpower of their crews than any feat of engineering. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming odds, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. Under the guidance of Frank Monroe and other leaders like him, the human resistance fought on, waging a guerrilla war against the Zaron occupiers on 100 different fronts. From the rubble-strewn streets of shattered cities to the dense jungles of remote colony worlds, the humans adapted and evolved, turning their enemies' strengths against them and exploiting every weakness in the Zaron war machine. For Monroe, the war had become a grim echo of his experiences in Vietnam so many decades ago. The tactics he had learned in that long-ago conflict, the hit-and-run raids, the booby traps, the psychological warfare, were now being employed on a galactic scale, with the fate of entire worlds hanging in the balance. But even as the humans fought with a tenacity and ingenuity that belied their dwindling numbers, Monroe knew that time was running out. The Zaron, despite their losses, still commanded vast resources and an inexhaustible supply of conscripted soldiers. Sooner or later, the human resistance would be ground down, its last strongholds overrun and its final defenders slaughtered. It was a fate that Monroe had seen before, in the haunted eyes of the Vietnamese villagers who had sheltered him and his comrades during the darkest days of the war. He remembered the way they had clung to their ancestral lands, even as the bombs fell and the napalm burned, their love for their homeland stronger than any fear of death or suffering. And now, as he looked out over the war-ravaged landscape of a once thriving human colony, Monroe saw that same love, that same unbreakable spirit, in the eyes of the men and women who fought at his side. They were fighting not just for their own lives, but for the future of their species, for the right of their children and their children's children to live free from the yoke of Zaron oppression. It was a cause that Monroe knew was worth fighting for, worth dying for. And so, even as the enemy closed in and the last embers of hope began to fade, the old soldier rallied his troops for one final stand. In a battle that would echo through the ages, the human resistance made its last stand on the planet Meridian, a world that had once been a shining beacon of human achievement and now served as the final bastion of the resistance. Against a Zaron force that outnumbered them 100 to 1, the humans fought with a courage and determination that staggered their alien foes. Led by Monroe, who fought with the strength and fury of a man half his age, the human defenders held their ground against wave after wave of Zaron attackers. They turned the planet's gleaming cities into death traps, luring the enemy into carefully prepared kill zones and unleashing devastating ambushes from the shadows. For days on end, the battle raged, the skies above Meridian lit by the fires of war and the ground beneath churned to mud by the ceaseless pounding of artillery and the tramping of countless soldiers. The Zaron, unused to such fierce resistance, threw themselves at the human lines with increasing desperation, expending their troops in fruitless assaults that left the field choked with their dead. But even the bravest defenders cannot hold out forever against overwhelming odds. As the battle entered its final hours, Monroe knew that the end was near. With ammunition running low and medical supplies all but exhausted, the human forces were slowly being whittled away, their numbers dwindling with every passing minute. Yet even in that darkest hour, the old soldier refused to yield. With a final, defiant roar, he led his remaining troops in a last, desperate charge against the Zaron lines, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible and to make their final stand one that would be remembered for generations to come. In the end, it was not enough. As the Zaron forces finally overran the last human positions, Monroe fell, his body riddled with wounds and his lifeblood seeping into the war-torn soil of Meridian. Around him, the remnants of his once proud army lay still and silent, their struggle finally at an end. But even as the darkness closed in around him and the last light faded from his eyes, Frank Monroe knew that his struggle had not been in vain. For in the courage and sacrifice of the human resistance, in the unbreakable spirit that had sustained them through the long years of war, he had seen the true strength of his species. And he knew that, even in defeat, the humans had won a victory that would endure long after the last Zaron banner had been torn down and the last alien boot had left the soil of a free and independent Earth. For in the hearts and minds of every human who had fought and died in the war, the flame of freedom still burned, unquenchable and eternal. As Monroe breathed his last, his thoughts turned to the jungles of Vietnam, to the young soldier he had once been and the lessons he had learned in that distant conflict. And he knew that, just as he had carried the wisdom of that war with him across the stars, so too would future generations of humans carry the lessons of the human Zaron war forward into an uncertain but undefeated future. For the human spirit, forged in the crucible of 1,000 battles and tempered by the unbreakable will to survive and prevail, could never be conquered. It would endure, as it always had, and as it always would, a light in the darkness and a beacon of hope for all the ages to come. And with that final, comforting thought, Frank Monroe, soldier, leader, and embodiment of the best of humanity, passed into legend, his legacy secure in the hearts and minds of the countless billions who would follow in his footsteps and carry on the fight for freedom and justice across the stars. In the years that followed the human Zaron war, the legend of Frank Monroe only grew. To the scattered remnants of humanity, struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of the devastating conflict, he became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder of the indomitable spirit that had sustained their species through its darkest hour. On Earth, now free from the yoke of Zaron occupation, monuments were raised in Monroe's honor, his name inscribed alongside those of the greatest heroes of human history. In the halls of power, newly minted leaders invoked his memory as they worked to forge a new and better future, one in which the hard-won lessons of the war would never be forgotten. But it was among the soldiers and veterans of the war that Monroe's legacy burned brightest. To them, he was more than just a hero, he was a father figure, a mentor, a living embodiment of the values and ideals for which they had fought and bled. In the years after the war, as humanity began to rebuild and expand once more, the veterans of the human Zaron War became the backbone of a new and revitalized human civilization. They brought with them the lessons of the war, the hard-earned wisdom and unbreakable spirit that had seen them through the darkest days of the conflict. Under their leadership, humanity reached out to the stars once more, not as conquerors or colonizers, but as explorers and diplomats, seeking to forge bonds of friendship and cooperation with the other sentient species of the galaxy. The old hostilities and prejudices that had once divided the galaxy began to fade, replaced by a new era of peace and understanding. At the heart of this new era was the memory of Frank Monroe and the countless other heroes who had given their lives in defense of human freedom and dignity. Their sacrifices, and the lessons they had taught, became the foundation upon which a new and better galactic order was built. As the years turned to decades and the decades to centuries, the legend of Frank Monroe endured, passed down from generation to generation as a reminder of the indomitable human spirit and the unbreakable will to fight for what was right. In the halls of learning, his story was taught alongside those of the great leaders and visionaries of the past, a testament to the enduring power of courage and conviction. And on 1,000 worlds across the galaxy, the descendants of the soldiers who had fought and died under Monroe's command gathered to honor his memory and to reaffirm their commitment to the ideals for which he had stood. In solemn ceremonies and joyous celebrations, they remembered the sacrifices of the past and looked to the future with hope and determination. For they knew, as Monroe had known, that the struggle for freedom and justice was never truly over. There would always be new challenges to face, new enemies to confront, new battles to be fought. But with the lessons of the past to guide them and the unbreakable human spirit to sustain them, they would never falter, never surrender. And so, as the galaxy turned and the centuries passed, the legacy of Frank Monroe endured, a shining beacon of hope and inspiration for all who sought to build a better and brighter future. In the hearts and minds of the countless billions who followed in his footsteps, his memory lived on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the unquenchable thirst for freedom and justice that had defined his life and his legacy. For as long as there were those who remembered his name and cherished his memory, Frank Monroe would never truly die. He would live on, a symbol of the best of humanity, a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had seen his species through its darkest hour and into a new and glorious dawn. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest legacy of all, the knowledge that, no matter how dark the night or how great the challenge, the human spirit would always endure, unbroken and undefeated, a light in the darkness and a beacon of hope for all the ages to come.